Let the scientist board first. Destroy the aircraft after confirmation. Rhodes typed those words without hesitation, calm, precise, the way a man orders lunch. He was never a hostage. The kidnapping was staged. The rescue mission was a trap. And the 8 American soldiers walking into that ambush had no idea. The man they risked everything to save had just signed their death warrants in the helicopter, pilots too. Seconds later, a missile rose from the ridge. The aircraft exploded. Brooke Sullivan went down with it. By sunrise, the Army listed her as killed in action. They were wrong. If this story moves you, subscribe right now and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The storm came in fast the way Pacific storms always do in the Cascades, not with warning, not with courtesy, just with violence. The kind of wind that bends old pine trees until they groan like something living and in pain. The kind of rain that turns mountain trails into rivers and riverbanks into mudslides. The kind of night that makes experienced men second-guess everything they thought they knew about the wilderness. Chief Warrant Officer Brooke Sullivan had been flying in conditions like this since she was 26 years old. She knew what the mountains did to helicopters. She knew what the mountains did to people. And she knew with a particular certainty that only comes from years of being the most prepared person in any room, that tonight was going to be complicated long before anyone else on the crew had finished checking their equipment. She sat in the pilot's seat of the Black Hawk going through her final checks and said nothing about the feeling in her chest. Not yet. There would be time to raise concerns. There always was. For now, she focused on what she could control: the instruments, the route, the altitude margins that would keep them above the worst of the ridge turbulence. Her co-pilot, Sergeant First Class Danny Reyes, glanced at the weather display and exhaled slowly. "Wind shear's picking up," he said. 40-knot gusts projected at the extraction zone. "I know," Brooke said. "Command still wants us on schedule." "Command always wants us on schedule, Danny." He nodded and went back to his instruments. That was the thing about flying with Brooke Sullivan. You learned quickly that her calmness was not indifference. It was preparation. Every calm word she spoke had 10 worries behind it that she had already considered, already planned for, already filed away, so they could not occupy space she needed for flying. The mission briefing had been straightforward. At least it had appeared to be straightforward. A classified Operation Iron Lantern focused on recovering Calvin Rhodes, a federal aerospace engineer who had been reported abducted by a domestic weapons network operating out of the northern Cascades. Rhodes held high-level clearance in drone defense technology. His capture was a national security concern. Lieutenant Grant Holloway's 8-member reconnaissance platoon was already on the ground, penetrating a decommissioned mining complex near the Canadian border. Brooke's job was extraction. Get Holloway's team out. Get Rhodes out. Get everyone home before the storm made flying impossible. Simple, clean, documented. Except Brooke Sullivan had been doing this long enough to know that the cleanest-looking operations were sometimes the ones that had the dirtiest secrets hiding underneath. She had read the Rhodes file 3 times on the transport flight to the staging area. Something about it bothered her in a way she could not yet name. Not a specific fact. Not a single detail she could point to and say, here, this is wrong. Just a feeling. The same feeling she had gotten years ago during a desert training exercise when the terrain looked exactly like the briefing map, but felt completely different beneath the aircraft. A feeling that turned out to be correct when they discovered the maps had been generated from outdated survey data. That time she had trusted the feeling. She had altered the approach. And because she had everyone on that helicopter made it home. She had not always been given credit for the decisions she made in the cockpit. There were officers who saw her in registered transport pilot, first woman second, and actual combat experience third. Men who talked over her in planning meetings. Men who smiled politely when she raised concerns, and then gave the same concerns more weight when one of her male counterparts echoed them 5 minutes later. Lieutenant Grant Holloway was not one of those men. She had met Holloway 4 years earlier during a training accident that should have killed him and 5 members of his team. A sudden terrain shift, a miscalculated approach, in a helicopter that was 30 seconds from making a very permanent decision on everyone's behalf. Brooke had put that aircraft down on a ridge that no one in the debrief could explain how she had even seen in those conditions. She had walked away from the landing with a cut above her eye and the quietly furious expression of someone who was extremely tired of other people's poor planning. Holloway had looked at her afterward with something she did not often receive from superior officers: respect without conditions. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" he had asked. "By surviving the times I almost didn't," she had answered. He had laughed, and they had trusted each other completely ever since. Now 40 minutes into the Iron Lantern insertion, she was listening to the radio traffic from Holloway's team with the focused attention of someone who understood that what people did not say was often more important than what they did. The platoon was moving through the eastern access tunnels of the Black Ridge mining complex. They had confirmed visual on the hostage. Rhodes was alive, mobile, and apparently unharmed. The platoon was consolidating for extraction. "Falcon 1, this is ground lead." Holloway's voice crackled through the headset. "We have the package. Repeat, we have the package. ETA to extraction zone, 7 minutes. "Copy, ground lead," Brooke answered. "I have you on approach. Conditions are rough up here. I'll keep her steady. You just get to the zone." "Wouldn't miss it. Out." Danny looked at her. "Sounded clean." "Yeah," she said. And she meant it. It had sounded clean. That was the part that was bothering her. She brought the Black Hawk around the ridgeline in a wide arc to bleed off altitude and approached the extraction zone from the south, the safest angle given the wind direction. Below her, through the rain and the tree canopy, she could see the infrared markers Holloway's team had placed. 6 of them, arranged exactly as briefed. She began her descent. The first thing she noticed when the platoon emerged from the tree line was Rhodes. He came out between 2 of Holloway's soldiers, walking steadily, carrying a reinforced aluminum case in his right hand. The case was locked with a combination mechanism. He had presumably recovered it from wherever it had been held during his abduction. That made sense. The technology inside was the entire reason for the operation, but something was wrong. Brooke could not articulate it as a sentence. She could only feel it with the part of her brain that had been trained to read situations the way a musician reads sheet music, not note by note, but all at once, the whole pattern, the whole shape of the thing. Rhodes's clothes were too clean. Not just clean, pressed. His jacket showed no mud, no tears, no evidence of 4 days in a mining complex where every surface was either rock dust or rust. His boots were dry. His hands, even from altitude, showed none of the defensive bruising that appeared on people who had been restrained against their will. He was not walking like a rescued man. He was walking like a man arriving somewhere he had planned to arrive. And there was something else, something she almost missed, because Holloway was already moving toward the helicopter, and the situation had the momentum of a planned operation in its final stage. The kind of momentum that is very, very hard to interrupt without sounding like you have lost your mind. Rhodes was looking at the helicopter's navigation array, not at the mountains, not at the sky, not at the soldiers around him, at the instruments, at the specific cluster of displays near the pilot's console that indicated signal frequency, communication range, and transponder output. He was looking at the helicopter like a man who needed to know exactly what it could transmit and exactly how far its signal would carry. "Danny," Brooke said, and her voice had changed in a way that Danny Reyes had heard exactly once before over the desert, 4 seconds before she altered the approach. "Something is wrong. What the approach looks. I don't know what it is yet, but something is wrong with Rhodes." Brooke command confirmed his. "I know what command confirmed. I'm telling you what I'm seeing." She pressed the radio transmit. "Ground lead, this is Falcon 1. Hold at the perimeter. Do not approach of the aircraft. Repeat, hold position. I need 30 seconds. There was a pause, then Holloway's voice. "Falcon 1, say again, we have the package, all personnel accounted for, ready to." "Grant." She used his first name. She never used his first name over the radio. "Please hold." Another pause, a shorter one. Then holding. "Talk to me." Something is off with the scientist. His clothes are clean. He's not looking at the sky, he's looking at our nav array. He hasn't asked about the colleagues who were supposedly taken with him. "I need you to ask him right now in front of your team what happened to the other people who were kidnapped at the same time he was." Silence on the radio. She could see Holloway below her, his posture changing, his head turning toward Rhodes. She could see Rhodes watching the helicopter. She could see the moment when something shifted. Some invisible, terrible gear, turning somewhere inside the operation, because she saw one of Holloway's soldiers reach toward his weapon, and she saw Rhodes take a half step backward toward the tree line, and she saw at the edge of her peripheral vision a light appear on the ridge to the northeast. Not a flashlight, not a signal flare, a guidance laser. Brake left, Danny shouted. She was already moving the controls before he finished the sentence. The Black Hawk lurched sideways and upward in the same violent motion, tail rotor swinging wide, and for exactly 1 second Brooke believed they were going to be fast enough. They were not fast enough. The missile struck the tail assembly with a sound she would not be able to describe afterward. Not an explosion, exactly, not like the explosions in films, but something more physical than that, something that went through the airframe and through her seat and through her bones all at once. The aircraft spun, the instruments went red. The world through the windshield became a blur of trees and rain and the dark mouth of the ravine below them. "Danny, brace!" she shouted, and she was already doing the only thing a pilot can do when a helicopter is going down with people inside it. She was flying. Not flying toward survival, maybe, but flying, making decisions, reducing the spin rate, controlling the descent angle, buying seconds with the only currency she had left, which was skill, and the willingness to keep working the problem until the problem ended. "I can't reach," Danny's voice cut off. "Hold on." She got the nose down. Got some forward momentum instead of pure spin. Aimed, if aimed was even the right word, for the narrowest gap in the tree canopy above the ravine bottom, where the river was, where there was at least the possibility of something softer than granite. The second explosion came from inside the cabin. She did not know at that moment what caused it. The fuel line, a weapons discharge, a secondary device, something Rhodes had placed aboard before they ever left the staging area perhaps, or something his people had done to the aircraft during the intelligence window when the operation was being planned. She only knew that the explosion came from behind her and that the heat was immediate and total, and that the aircraft was no longer going to make it to any kind of clearing. The Black Hawk went into the trees. Brooke Sullivan did not remember the impact. She remembered the sound of the river. She remembered cold, the specific, merciless cold of snowmelt, running over rock in October. The kind of cold that does not feel like temperature so much as it feels like absence, as if everything warm is being pulled out of you and replaced with nothing. She remembered opening her eyes and seeing above her the wreckage of the tail section resting against a tree trunk, and understanding with the slow and enormous clarity of a concussed brain reassembling itself that she was alive, that the aircraft had broken apart on the way down and a section of the fuselage had landed across the boulders at the river's edge, and she was beneath it, half in the water and half out, and she was alive. She did not move immediately. The training, 8 years of survival instructor training, hundreds of field exercises, dozens of real-world scenarios came in through the pain and the cold and the confusion and said, "Stop. Assess. Do not make anything worse than it already is." She moved her fingers first. Left hand responded. Right hand responded. She moved her feet. Both feet responded. She tried to lift her left arm, and the pain was so severe that she pressed her lips together and held it for 5 full seconds before she accepted that her left wrist was broken. She breathed carefully because each breath brought a grinding sensation along her left side that suggested ribs, not a single broken rib. Multiple, at least 3, maybe 4. She had broken ribs before during a training fall, and she recognized the particular arithmetic of that pain, the way it multiplied with each inhale, the way it turned something as simple as breathing into a negotiation. Her flight helmet was gone. She did not know where. Somewhere in the ravine. Her radio was gone. She found the housing still clipped to her vest, but the internal components had been destroyed by either the impact or the water. She pressed the transmit button anyway and heard nothing. She was, as far as the Army was concerned, dead. She did not allow herself to sit with that thought for more than a moment, because if she sat with it too long, it would become something she believed. And if she believed it, the next decision she would face was whether to keep moving or to stop. And stopping in an October river gorge in the Cascade Mountains with fractured ribs and a broken wrist in an outside temperature that was dropping toward freezing, stopping was not a decision. Stopping was a conclusion. "Not yet," she said aloud, to herself, to the river, to the rain that was still falling through the broken canopy above her. Not yet. She freed herself from beneath the fuselage section. Using a rescue axe she found still clipped inside the wreckage. The handle cracked, the blade dulled but functional. She worked for 20 minutes to shift the metal enough to pull herself clear using her right arm and her legs keeping her left wrist immobile against her body. She crawled to a dry overhang above the waterline and began the work of staying alive. She packed the wound on her shoulder with materials stripped from the fuselage insulation. She improvised a wrist splint from 2 pieces of aluminum channel and a length of webbing from a broken equipment strap. She collected rainwater from a natural depression in the rock face and drank slowly. She found a section of thermal insulation from the crew compartment that was mostly dry and wrapped it around herself and sat with her back against the rock wall and let her body's remaining warmth stabilize before she made any further demands of it. She did not sleep. She was afraid that if she slept, she would not wake up. Not because of her injuries, though the injuries were serious, but because of the temperature. Hypothermia was quieter than a missile. It came without noise and without drama, and it simply made you comfortable with dying, which was the most dangerous thing it did. So she stayed awake, and she thought about what she had seen. Rhodes' clean clothes, Rhodes looking at the nav array, the guidance laser on the ridge, the transmit order that she had almost sent. She had been 1 sentence away from warning Holloway to pull back when the missile hit. 1 sentence, 30 seconds. If she had spoken 30 seconds earlier, the aircraft might have been far enough from the launch point that the missile would have missed entirely, or struck at an angle that allowed a controlled crash, or... She stopped that thought. 30 seconds was gone. The aircraft was gone. The radio was gone. And somewhere above her on the mountain, Lieutenant Grant Holloway and his platoon were either dead or captured, and the man who had arranged their deaths was walking free with classified technology and an aluminum case in the confidence of someone who believed that all the witnesses had been eliminated. She was the only witness left. She pressed her right hand against the rock and made a decision. In the gray pre-dawn light, she began climbing. It took her 4 hours to reach the main crash site. 4 hours that under normal conditions would have been a 40-minute hike. The terrain was brutal, steep, wet root tangled with sections of loose shale that gave way unexpectedly and sent her scrambling on 3 limbs while her broken wrist screamed at every near fall. She stopped twice when the rib pain became severe enough to compromise her breathing, sitting completely still for 3-minute intervals until the sharpest edge of it receded. She found the crash site by smell before she found it by sight. The main fuselage had come down on the slope above the ravine. Most of it had burned, which meant the fuel bladders had ruptured on impact, a fact that told her the fire had been fast and hot, invisible for miles in every direction, which meant anyone on that ridgeline who had been watching would have seen it and reported it and marked the aircraft as destroyed, which meant they would not have come looking for survivors, which meant she was in fact invisible. She moved through the wreckage, carefully looking at the ground around it, the way she had been trained to read terrain, not as scenery but as information. The rain had softened everything, which made the story easier to read. Boot prints, military tread, the deep aggressive lug pattern of Army-issue combat boots. Multiple sets. At least 8 distinct patterns, possibly 9 or 10, including the platoon members plus the mercenaries who had moved in after the ambush. Drag marks, not bodies. She recognized that immediately. Bodies being dragged created a different kind of disturbance in the mud, heavier, more continuous. These marks were lighter, the marks of men who were moving under their own power, but being directed, being pushed their steps, stumbling, but not absent. They were alive. She stood in the rain and let herself feel that for exactly 5 seconds, the pure, almost unbearable relief of it, the knowledge that the soldiers were alive, and then she filed it away and went back to reading the scene. Spent cartridge casings scattered across a 40-foot radius. Several fired from a central position, dozens from positions around the perimeter. The pattern told her the platoon had formed a defensive circle and held it until ammunition ran out. They had not broken and run. They had fought in formation and been taken by weight of numbers alone. Blood on the ground, but not in the quantities that would indicate fatal wounds. Injuries that had been walked away from or dragged away from, but survived. She counted the boot patterns again, carefully tracing each set through the mud to where it joined the main direction of travel, north-northwest, toward the ridge, toward the Canadian border, which was approximately 40 miles through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the continental United States. 40 miles. She had no rifle. She had a damaged rescue axe, a folding field knife she had found in the wreckage, a fire-starting kit from an emergency pouch, and approximately enough food, 2 compressed ration bars she had found in a flight suit pocket for 1 meal. She had a broken wrist, cracked ribs, a dressed but unsutured shoulder wound, a concussion, and no communication. The Army thought she was dead. She looked north-northwest into the rain and the trees. "Okay," she said quietly. She started walking. She found the satellite transmitter on her second hour of tracking. It was concealed beneath a section of crashed debris near the eastern edge of the impact zone, wedged into a gap in the rock where the explosion would not have reached it. It was not Army equipment. She had never seen the model before, but she recognized the design language: secure burst transmission, low-profile antenna, military-grade encryption housing. The kind of device that was not purchased at any civilian electronics retailer and was not carried by federal engineers under any standard protocol she had ever encountered. She powered it on with one hand, bracing it against the rock with her injured arm to operate the interface with her right hand. The message log required a code she did not have, but the transmission history, the metadata, the timestamps, the destination addresses was partially visible in a recovery screen that the device's manufacturer had clearly intended as a maintenance diagnostic, never imagining that someone would be reading it in the rain on the side of a Cascade mountain with cracked ribs and a broken wrist. She read it twice to make sure she understood what she was seeing. The coordinates of the extraction zone transmitted to this device at 47 hours, 3 hours before the mission began. The scheduled arrival time of the aircraft transmitted at 16:02 hours, 1 hour before wheels up. And the final message, the one that had been sent at 18:33 hours, 22 minutes before the missile struck: "Let the scientist board first. Destroy the aircraft after confirmation. Rhodes." The man they had gone to rescue was the man who had planned the ambush. He had provided the location. He had provided the schedule. He had timed the attack to ensure that Holloway's platoon would be on the ground, out of ammunition, and outnumbered when the mercenaries came in. He had boarded the helicopter not because he needed to escape, but because he needed to be confirmed aboard to give the signal to be seen in position so that the launch order would be credible. He had been willing to burn to death in a helicopter for 30 seconds of credibility. No, that was wrong. He had known the timing. He had known he would have enough time to get off the aircraft before the missile hit. Or perhaps he had assumed the aircraft would be far enough from the explosion to allow survival. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that turned her stomach in a way that pain and cold had not managed to, he had simply calculated that his own life was a fair risk against the payout waiting for him on the other side of the border. Silas Voss. The name was in the metadata header of the final transmission, an organizational identifier she had never seen before, but one that the intelligence community would recognize: a private weapons organization. A man who paid for classified information in quantities that made betrayal look to certain kinds of minds like a rational career decision. Rhodes had used the platoon as props in his own disappearance. He had staged a kidnapping, recruited mercenaries to make it convincing, allowed American soldiers to walk into a fortified ambush, and then arranged for all of them to be killed before they could tell anyone what they had seen. He had been planning to vanish with Voss's money and the stolen technology while the Army buried 8 soldiers and a helicopter pilot. Except the helicopter pilot was not buried. Brooke tucked the satellite transmitter into her vest. She would need it. She found the first of Holloway's markers 2 hours later. A strip of medical tape, the kind used for field dressings, tied around the underside of a branch at knee height on the north side of a Douglas fir. She would have missed it if she had not been looking for exactly this kind of thing, not a sign intended for anyone in particular, but a sign left anyway, because leaving something is better than leaving nothing, and because Holloway, whatever else he was facing, had not entirely given up on the possibility that someone might still be following. She untied the tape and held it in her hand for a moment. He did not know she was alive. He was leaving marks for a ghost. She pressed the tape between her fingers carefully and then continued north. She found the broken compass needle an hour after that, pressed into the mud at the base of a rock formation with the direction indicator pointing north-northwest. She found the bootmark sequence, 4 steps in a triangle pattern, military tracking language for prisoner convoy, moving under guard in a clearing where the mud was deep enough to hold the impressions despite the rain. I was telling her everything she needed to know. He was telling her with the calm, methodical persistence of a man who understood that despair was a luxury he could not afford while his soldiers were watching him. She moved faster than she should have moved. She knew she was moving faster than she should have. The ribs reminded her with every steep section of trail, every ducked branch, every misstep that sent her weight onto her left side. But she could feel time the way you feel a tide, not as an abstract concept, but as a physical force moving against her, carrying the platoon toward the border at a rate that her injured body could not fully match. On the second night, the cold nearly beat her. She had found a rock overhang sufficient to break the wind and had built a fire from dry pine debris using the kit from her vest, a process that took 45 minutes with one functional hand, and had sat beside it with the thermal insulation around her and absolutely refused to stop shivering and accept the warmth that hypothermia offers in its final stage. She had seen that warmth claim a training candidate once. He had stopped shivering, which sounded like a good sign to everyone who did not know what it meant. She had known. She had gotten him into an emergency bivouac in time. She had told him afterward that the warmth was a lie. "It tells you that you're okay," she had said. "It tells you that you can rest. It tells you the worst is over. It is lying to every nerve ending in your body simultaneously. It is the most comfortable lie a mountain will ever offer you. Do not believe it." She sat beside her small fire in the dark and talked to herself. Not to keep herself company, to keep herself present. She narrated what she was doing and why she was doing it and what she intended to do next. She talked about Holloway's markers. She talked about the satellite transmitter. She talked about what she was going to say to Dr. Calvin Rhodes when she found him. She talked until the fire was ash and the first pale suggestion of dawn appeared above the eastern ridgeline. Then she stood up, picked up the rescue axe, and continued north. The Ranger Communications Tower appeared on the third day, like something out of a story she might have told herself to stay awake. A structure she had no reason to believe would still be functional, with no reason to believe she could operate it in her condition, with no reason to believe that any signal she managed to send would reach anyone with the authority to act on it. She climbed the access ladder with her right arm and both legs in her teeth. When she needed them, the broken wrist held against her body, the ribs staging a protest that she noted and overruled. The transmitter board had not been powered in years. Several relays were corroded. The primary frequency amplifier was destroyed, which meant long-range transmission was impossible. But the emergency backup circuit, a separate, simpler system designed for exactly this scenario. For the ranger who was injured or cut off and needed to send something rather than nothing, still showed continuity when she tested it with a wire from a disassembled flashlight she found in the tower's equipment locker. She worked for 2 hours. She sent the message in 3 bursts, each one as tight and specific as she could make it, prioritizing content over length, because she did not know how long the circuit would hold or how long she had before another patrol came through this section of the mountain. Iron Lantern compromised. Platoon alive. Rhodes is the traitor. She sent it 3 times on 3 different emergency frequencies. Then the circuit failed. She sat on the floor of the Ranger Tower with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling, and she allowed herself for the first time in 3 days to acknowledge the complete and entire possibility that no one had received anything she had sent, that the platoon was going to cross that border, that Rhodes was going to get away, that she had crawled out of a river and climbed a mountain and walked 40 miles through the worst terrain in the Pacific Northwest for nothing. She allowed herself exactly 4 minutes to sit with that. Then she stood up, because on the 4th morning before she had found the tower, before she had sent the message, she had crested a ridge in the early dawn light and seen in the valley below her the dark geometric shape of a facility that should not have been there. Windows with light behind them, a perimeter fence activity, a landing area with a helicopter sitting on it, with its rotors tied down against the wind. Black Ridge Mine. She knew where they were. She had been to mines before during training exercises. She knew the architecture, the access tunnels, the ventilation systems, the drainage passages that connected underground sections to surface exits hundreds of feet from the main entrance. And she had 4 months of mission planning experience that told her exactly how a facility like that would be secured. The question was not whether she could get in. The question was what she was going to do when she did. She descended the ridge in the gray morning light, moving carefully, hugging the tree line. Below her in the valley, the lights of Black Ridge Mine burned steadily against the storm. Inside that building were men who had been told she was dead. She intended to correct that impression. She moved through the trees and the rain fell, and somewhere in the darkness ahead of her, Lieutenant Grant Holloway was keeping 5 exhausted, injured soldiers alive by asking them what they planned to do when they got home. He was leaving space in that question for Brooke Sullivan. He did not know she was coming. He believed she might be coming anyway. And that belief, that fragile, irrational, completely human insistence that the person you trust is still out there somewhere, had kept him moving those markers, those strips of tape and needle and boot print sequences across 40 miles of mountain wilderness. One person's survival had always depended on another person's refusal to stop hoping. Brooke Sullivan reached the perimeter of Black Ridge Mine as the first pale edge of sunrise appeared above the eastern Cascades. She had 3 hours. She had a damaged axe, a field knife, a satellite transmitter, and 4 days of rage at a man who had decided that American soldiers were acceptable losses in his personal accounting. She crouched at the edge of this tree line, studied the fence line, studied the camera positions, and began to plan. The perimeter fence was 12 feet high, topped with 3 strands of wire, and monitored by 4 cameras positioned at 45-degree angles from the corners of the facility. Brooke had counted them twice from the tree line. She had also counted the patrol rotation, 2 guards moving in opposite directions along the fence exterior, crossing at the northeast corner every 11 minutes. 11 minutes was enough. She had been sitting in the cold for 20 minutes already, watching cataloging filing. Her ribs had settled into a grinding rhythm that matched her heartbeat, a constant low-level reminder that her body was operating well past the point where most people would have stopped moving. She acknowledged it the way she acknowledged weather. It was information. It was not permission to quit. The camera at the southwest corner had a 2-degree downward tilt that the person who installed it had probably not intended. It created a blind strip approximately 4 feet wide along the base of the fence directly below it. Brooke had noticed the tilt in the first 30 seconds of observation and had spent the following 19 minutes confirming it every time the camera completed its sweep. 4 feet was enough. She moved at the 6-minute mark of the patrol cycle, crossing the open ground in a low-controlled sprint that cost her more than she showed. The ribs tightened with every footfall. She hit the fence base and pressed herself flat against it and held still while the camera finished its arc above her. The wire cutters she had were not wire cutters. They were the hinge pins from the rescue axe, straightened and shaped, using a rock in the edge of the axe blade, in a process that had taken her 40 minutes in the Ranger Tower the night before while she was waiting for the transmission circuit to warm up. They were, by any reasonable standard, terrible wire cutters. But the fence at the base was older than the cameras. She could see the oxidation on the lower links, and older wire has less integrity. She worked the links apart rather than cutting them, manipulating each connection until the metal fatigued and gave way. She was through the fence with 90 seconds to spare before the guards crossed at the northeast corner. Inside the perimeter, she moved along the interior face of the fence toward the maintenance structure she had identified from the ridge, an older concrete building attached to the mine's original access shaft, predating the current facility by at least 30 years. The drainage passage she was looking for would connect to that structure. It had to. Every mine of this era and this depth used the same basic engineering logic: water always moves down, and the people who built these facilities always provided it somewhere to go. She found the drainage grate in the floor of the maintenance structure, half hidden under a rusted equipment shelf that had not been moved in years. She moved the shelf with her right arm and the leverage of her body and ignored the sound her ribs made about that decision. The grate lifted with a grinding protest that seemed to her ears loud enough to be heard in Vancouver. She waited 5 seconds. No response from outside. She lowered herself into the passage. The water in the drainage channel was 4 inches deep and approximately the same temperature as the river where she had woken up 4 days ago. She moved through it on her hands and knees, one hand technically given the wrist, and counted her movements by the sections of pipe that crossed overhead. She had memorized the layout from the evacuation map she had found in the Ranger Tower. 12 pipe crossings to the first junction, then right toward the central processing section, then another 8 crossings to the detention area. She was at the 7th pipe crossing when she heard Rhodes's voice. He was above her, not directly above, somewhere in the facility, in a room with enough ventilation connection to the drainage system that his voice carried down into the passage with the particular hollow resonance of concrete and old metal. She could not make out every word, but she heard enough. She heard him say, by sunrise, everything needs to be packaged and ready for transport by sunrise. She heard a second voice lower, more deliberate, with the flat affect of a man who was accustomed to giving instructions that were always followed. That voice said, and the soldiers, Rhodes said, they're not my problem after tonight. Brooke went absolutely still in the cold water. She had known what she was walking into. She had known it intellectually, in the way that you can know a fact completely and still need a moment when it lands with its full weight. They're not my problem after tonight. 8 words that he had given authorization for what came next. 8 words from a man who had been cleared by the United States government, trusted with national security technology, given access to intelligence that had been used to send soldiers into an ambush. 8 words that she committed to memory because she was going to make sure someone else heard them too. She kept moving. She was at the 12th pipe crossing when she heard the first sounds from the detention area, boots on concrete, a low murmur of voices, the specific cadence of men keeping themselves occupied because stillness was the enemy of morale. She recognized that cadence. She had heard it before in debriefs from soldiers who had survived extended captivity. The ones who came out intact were always the ones who had found something to do with their minds, something to anchor them to the forward direction. She found the access point, a drainage cleanout port, in the passage ceiling that connected to a service crawl space above the detention room floor. She eased the cap off with agonizing slowness and pulled herself up into the crawl space. Through the ventilation slats in the floor, she could see them. Holloway was seated against the far wall, which meant he had positioned himself where he could watch both the door and the full room simultaneously. His face was marked, a cut above his right eye, bruising along his jaw, the particular careful way he was holding himself that told her at least one rib was cracked. But his eyes were clear, alert, doing the continuous calculation of a man who had not stopped planning since the moment they took his weapons. 5 soldiers around him. She counted them the way she had counted everything else in the last 4 days, carefully, completely, with a specific attention to detail that comes from understanding that every number is a person, and every person is someone who needs to go home. Corporal Noah Bennett was the youngest of them, 22, maybe 23, with the kind of face that still looked surprised when things went wrong, as if some part of him had not fully accepted that the world could be as difficult as his training had promised. He was sitting cross-legged on the concrete, turning something over in his hands. She recognized it after a moment, a strip of medical tape. One of Holloway's markers, which Bennett must have taken when they passed it on the trail. A small and private act of preservation. I was keeping it. Holloway's voice was low and steady. He was talking to the room. Okay, he was saying, we're doing this again, each of you. When we get out, not if, when. What's the first thing you do when you get home? And I want specific answers, not spend time with my family. Specific. A soldier near the door. Sergeant Marcus Webb, she remembered from the mission briefing, a 12-year veteran with 2 deployments, said, I'm going to go to that barbecue place in Tacoma that I keep telling my wife about, and I'm going to eat an entire rack of ribs without apologizing to anyone. Good, Holloway said. Specific. I like that. I'm going to call my brother, another voice said. We haven't talked in 8 months. We had a stupid argument about I don't even remember what it was about. I'm going to call him. You're going to call him, Holloway agreed. What else? Bennett spoke quietly, still turning the medical tape over in his hands. I want to find out if she made it. The room went quiet. No one needed to ask who he meant. Bennett, Holloway said, Sir, I know. I know what the probability is. I didn't say stop. I said your name. Bennett looked up. She told us once in the pre-mission briefing that she had never accepted impossible odds without testing them first. I was thinking about that. She said the difference between a pilot who gets people home and a pilot who doesn't is usually just one more decision. One more thing they tried before they gave up. The room was still. Holloway was looking at the floor. His jaw was working slowly the way it did when he was containing something he did not intend to put into the room. Then he looked up. Then let's give her something to come back to, he said. Because if Brooke Sullivan is alive out there, and I am not prepared to accept otherwise until I see evidence she is working the problem. Right now, whatever condition she's in, whatever she's had to do to get this far, she is working the problem. And the best thing we can do for her is stay functional and stay ready, because when she comes, it is going to be fast, and we are going to need to be able to move." The room absorbed that, Joe. Then Webb said, "And if she's not coming," Holloway looked at him steadily, "then we figure it out ourselves, but I'd rather plan for her than against her. She's never given me a reason to give up on her yet." Brooke lay in the crawl space above them and felt something move through her that was not pain and was not cold and was not the disciplined forward momentum of the last 4 days. It was something older than training, something that did not have a tactical application and did not belong on any survival checklist. It was the specific, devastating knowledge that someone believed in you. She allowed herself 3 seconds of it. Then she moved back down into the drainage passage to figure out how to get them out. The facility layout revealed itself to her systematically as she moved through the lower access sections. She had 37 minutes before the shift change that would bring a fresh rotation of guards into the detention corridor. She had timed the patterns from the crawl space and confirmed them against what she had observed from the ridge. 37 minutes to understand the building well enough to use it against itself. The power distribution center was in the northeast section of the facility, accessible from the maintenance tunnel through a utility junction she found at the 14 pipe mark. She spent 4 minutes studying the panel. It was older than the rest of the installation, probably from the original mining operation with modern circuit additions, bolted onto a framework that had been designed for industrial equipment rather than a fortified compound. The emergency lighting circuit was separate from the main grid, which was standard. The conveyor system, a massive obsolete ore transport mechanism that ran through 3 sections of the facility and exited through the east processing tunnel, was connected to its own dedicated circuit with a direct feed from the main panel. She studied the conveyor circuit for a long time. The conveyor had not been run in years. She could tell from the dust on the drive mechanism and the rust on the guide rollers. But the circuit was intact. She tested continuity with the wire from the flashlight, the same wire she had used in the Ranger Tower. The circuit was intact and the load capacity was sufficient, and the machinery, if it suddenly activated, would make a sound that a fortified mining compound's worth of mercenaries would respond to exactly the way. Startled men with guns always responded to unexpected industrial noise by running toward it and pointing weapons at it. She spent 12 minutes working the power routing. Then she moved to the ventilation system. The ventilation in Black Ridge Mine used a forced air network that connected the surface blower units to every section of the facility through a series of damper-controlled ducts. She found the central damper control in the utility junction, a manual lever system, also from the original installation, also not upgraded, and spent 8 minutes understanding which ducts connected to which sections. The maintenance access corridor, which ran between the detention area and the east processing tunnel, had 2 ventilation inlets. Both were large enough to pass significant airflow. The surface blower units drew air across the facility's generator exhaust, a fact she confirmed by the smell in the utility junction. The particular combination of diesel particulate and mountain air that meant the generators were located upwind of the primary intake. Generator exhaust, moving through ventilation ducts, into a corridor, not enough to be dangerous, but enough to be visible. She began to understand what the next 90 minutes were going to look like. She also found the radio room. She was not supposed to find the radio room from the drainage system, but she found it because someone had run a secondary power conduit through the utility junction, a recent installation. The wiring still bright and unoxidized, and she followed it the way she followed everything, patiently, completely. Because in her experience, things that had been hidden were usually hidden because they were important. The conduit led to a communication station that had been set up in what had originally been a mine surveyor's office. She could hear activity through the wall, 2 operators she estimated from the pattern of keystrokes and the occasional clipped exchange of acknowledgement codes. She pressed her ear against the conduit housing. Rhodes's voice again, clearer this time. He was in the radio room or just outside it. "The buyer confirms receipt of the authentication package. They want delivery before 0400. The lower voice Voss responded, "And transport. My helicopter. I want to be airborne by 0330. 0330, she checked her internal clock against the time she had entered the facility. She had been inside for 31 minutes. The current time was approximately 0249. She had 41 minutes. She moved faster. In the crawlspace above the detention room, she took 60 seconds to make a decision she had been turning over since she entered the facility. There were 6 soldiers below her and at minimum 30 armed mercenaries in the compound, with more on the perimeter. A direct confrontation was a conclusion, not a tactic. She needed to divert enough of Voss's people away from the detention area to give Holloway's team time to move through the east processing tunnel before the perimeter response sealed the exits, which meant she needed to activate the conveyor before she reached the prisoners, which meant she needed to go back to the power distribution center, which meant she had 23 minutes instead of 41. She went back through the drainage passage at a pace that her ribs registered as deeply unreasonable. She did not stop. She found the power panel and made the connections she had planned the conveyor circuit into the main distribution load. The ventilation dampers adjusted to push exhaust carrying air toward the western processing section. The emergency lighting circuit isolated so that when the main power dropped, the lights in the facility would go to the dim, disorienting orange of backup illumination rather than full darkness. Full darkness was dangerous for 6 injured soldiers navigating an unfamiliar facility. Dim, disorienting orange was dangerous for mercenaries who were expecting it to be light. She also activated the maintenance radio handset she had found clipped to the utility junction wall, a channel-locked unit that transmitted on the facility's internal communication frequency. She did not speak into it yet. She held it and moved back toward the detention area. She had 18 minutes. She was at the drainage clean-out below the detention room crawl space with 14 minutes remaining when she heard the patrol change in the corridor above her. 2 sets of boots, a brief exchange, a door. She waited, counted to 30, then pulled herself back into the crawl space. She had not worked out what she was going to say to Holloway. She had been so focused on the mechanics of getting in that she had not fully addressed the mechanics of what happened in the first 5 seconds when she dropped through the ventilation panel into a room containing 6 highly trained soldiers who believed she was dead. She accepted that this was going to be somewhat complicated. She eased the ventilation panel aside and lowered herself through the opening. She dropped into the detention room at 0319. The soldier nearest the ventilation panel, Sergeant Webb, spun toward the movement with his hands up in a defensive posture and said a word that was not appropriate for any context she could think of. Bennett across the room came to his feet so fast he hit his head on the low pipe above his seat and said nothing at all, just stood with his mouth open. 2 other soldiers reached instinctively for weapons they no longer had, and Holloway against the far wall went completely, utterly still. He looked at her for a long moment, the torn flight gear, the improvised wrist splint, the 4 days of wilderness on her face and hands, and he said nothing. His jaw moved. Nothing came out. "Grant," she said quietly. He exhaled. It was a long sound, the sound of something held very tightly for a very long time finally being allowed to release. "You were inside that helicopter," he whispered. "I was inside that helicopter," she confirmed. "The aircraft went down in the ravine. Command listed you. I know what command listed me as. You walked 40 miles, approximately." He looked at her wrist, at her shoulder, at the way she was standing slightly tilted, protecting her left side. His eyes moved across the inventory of her injuries with the rapid assessment of a soldier reading a situation, and she could see the exact moment when he understood the full cost of what she was standing in front of him. "Brooke," he said. "We have 11 minutes, she said, "before what I set up in the power room activates. When it does, I need your team moving through the east processing tunnel immediately. I've opened the drainage access in the south corridor. It connects to the exterior maintenance structure outside the perimeter fence. There is a gap in the fence at the southwest corner base level, approximately 4 feet wide. That is your exit." He stared at her. 11 minutes, he said. 10 and a half now. "You came in through the drainage system." "Yes. With a broken wrist. It's a fracture, not a complete break. That is not the reassuring distinction you think it is." Bennett stepped forward. His voice was rough in a way that 22-year-old voices should not be. "How are you alive?" Brooke looked at him. "The same way you're going to get home, Corporal, by refusing to accept the alternative." He nodded once, and she saw him take the strip of medical tape he had been holding and press it into his jacket pocket close to his body in the way people keep things they intend to keep permanently. Holloway was already organizing his soldiers. He did it without raising his voice, with the quiet, decisive efficiency of a man who had been keeping his team alive by maintaining their readiness for exactly this moment. Webb, take point. Bennett, you're with me. Henderson, Garza, you're covering the rear. Stay low, stay quiet, and do exactly what she says when she says it. He looked at Brooke. She handed him the maintenance radio. When the conveyor starts, you'll hear it through the walls. That's your signal. Count to 30, then move. The guards will be heading west. Your corridor will be clear for approximately 4 minutes. And you, power. I'll be right behind you. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had heard that phrase before and knew what it sometimes meant. I need you to actually be right behind me, he said. Not just tactically right behind me, actually. You understand me? I understand you. Oh. Brooke. Grant, I came back for you. I am not interested in leaving without you. Move your people. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned and the soldiers formed up behind Webb, and the room that had held them captive for 4 days became in the span of 30 seconds, simply a room. She moved back toward the utility junction for the last time. She had 4 minutes. She used 2 of them to record the transmission from Rhodes's radio room. She pressed the satellite transmitter's active receiver against the conduit housing where his voice was clearest and captured 47 seconds of audio that contained in sequence the buyer's authentication code, the time of the scheduled handoff, the confirmation that the stolen research was aboard the aluminum case, and Rhodes saying in his own voice at 03:26 in the morning, I authorized the attack on the helicopter. Yes, they all had to go. There couldn't be any witnesses. She had the confession. She had 2 minutes. She threw the conveyor circuit breaker at 03:28. The machinery came alive in a roar that shook the utility junction walls, decades of dormant industrial motion, suddenly crashing back into operation. The entire conveyor system lurching into movement in 3 sections, simultaneously triggering vibration sensors, triggering motion alerts, triggering the response that she had calculated, voices shouting boots on concrete, the entire western section of the facility suddenly in motion toward a non-existent emergency. She picked up the maintenance radio and she spoke into it in the clipped, slightly distorted voice she had been rehearsing since she listened to the guards' radio exchanges from the crawl space, an approximation of the tone and cadence of the shift supervisor's voice she had heard 3 times during her time in the facility. All units, East Perimeter breach confirmed. Repeat, East Perimeter breach. All available personnel to the East Processing Tunnel. Seal the East exit. She watched the audio level on the radio and listened to the acknowledgments come back. 8 of them. 8 guards redirecting to the East Tunnel exit, which was not where Holloway's team was going, because she had told them South Corridor drainage axis, Southwest corner. The East Tunnel was the decoy. 30 seconds of chaos in a facility is an eternity when you know what you are doing. She started moving toward the landing area. She had a confession on a satellite transmitter and a man to stop and approximately 300 things that could go wrong between her current position and the outcome she was working toward. Her ribs did not have an opinion about any of this, or if they did, she had stopped listening. She moved through the smoke-filled maintenance corridor. Ventilation dampers had done their job, pushing exhaust particulate air through the western ducts in a gray haze that the backup lighting turned amber and strange. And she thought about what Rhodes had said on that transmitter. I authorized the attack on the helicopter. They all had to go. She thought about Danny Reyes, her co-pilot, who had shouted a warning in the last second before the missile hit. She thought about the 2 crew members who had jumped clear, whether they had made it, whether the search teams had found them, whether anyone was looking. She thought about all of it, and she kept moving because the alternative was to stop. And she had already decided 4 days ago in a river gorge, with cracked ribs and a broken wrist, that stopping was not available to her. The landing area was 30 meters ahead. She could hear the helicopter's engine beginning to spool up. Rhodes was leaving, and the satellite transmitter in her vest had 47 seconds of his voice, saying things that would end his career, his freedom, and his certainty that he had gotten away with it. She ran. She was running on fumes and fury and the specific kind of focus that only comes when every other option has been exhausted. 30 meters to the landing area. The helicopter engine was building. She could hear the rotor blades beginning their slow rotation, accelerating, the sound climbing from a low mechanical groan into the urgent whine of a machine preparing to leave. She had maybe 90 seconds before it had enough power to lift. Maybe less. She did not know the specific aircraft type from sound alone, but she knew helicopter startup sequences the way she knew her own heartbeat, and this one was moving fast. She came through the maintenance corridor door at 0331 and crossed the open ground toward the landing pad without slowing. Rhodes was at the aircraft. She could see him through the plexiglass in the left seat headset on the aluminum case strapped to the seat beside him. He had his hands on the controls and his eyes on the instruments, and he was not looking at the ground outside the aircraft because why would he? The facility was in controlled chaos behind him. The conveyor was screaming, his guards were responding to what they believed was a perimeter breach, and the woman he had tried to kill was dead at the bottom of a ravine. He had no reason to look outside. She reached the exterior service panel on the aircraft's right side at 0332. Every helicopter has an external fuel management access point. It is designed for ground crew for pre-flight servicing for situations where the pilot cannot reach or operate the interior fuel controls. It is not designed to be used by a person with a fractured wrist and cracked ribs while the aircraft's engine is already running. But Brooke Sullivan had spent 11 years around helicopters, and she knew the location of this panel on every aircraft type in the Army's inventory. And she knew that knowing something completely is sometimes the only tool you have left. She worked the panel with her right hand. The fuel flow control lever was stiff, cold weather stiffness compounded by years of infrequent use on a private aircraft that was not maintained to military standards. She applied pressure, more pressure. The lever moved 2 positions and locked. The engine note changed immediately. It did not stop. The aircraft did not fall out of the air. But the fuel flow irregularity registered on the instruments inside the cockpit, and she knew the exact moment Rhodes saw it because the rotor acceleration stopped, held. The engine sound plateaued at a power level that could sustain ground operation but could not safely generate lift. She stepped back from the panel. The cockpit door opened. Rhodes came out of the helicopter the way men come out of situations. They believe they control quickly, impatiently with the particular irritation of someone whose schedule has been interrupted by mechanical failure. He had a pistol, he had the aluminum case in his left hand, and he was looking at the service panel she had just closed, not at her, and so the first moment he registered that she existed was when she spoke. "Dr. Rhodes," he spun. She watched it happen, the recognition, the impossibility, the rapid invisible collapse of the certainty he had built his entire plan upon. His face went through 3 distinct stages in approximately 2 seconds: confusion, recognition, and then something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. The specific expression of a man whose most fundamental assumption has just been proven catastrophically wrong. "You're dead," he said. It was not an accusation. It was not even a statement, really. It was a man testing a fact he had believed to be settled. "You've been wrong about a lot of things this week," Brooke said. "Add that one to the list." He raised the pistol. She did not move. She had made the calculation before she crossed the landing pad. If he intended to shoot her immediately, she would already be dead. The fact that he had not fired in the first second meant he was thinking. And a man who was thinking was a man who could be talked to, and a man who could be talked to was a man who could be recorded, and she had the satellite transmitter active in her vest pocket with its receiver oriented toward him. "How?" he said. The pistol was steady. His voice was not. "The aircraft was destroyed. I saw the confirmation. The facility team confirmed no survivors." "Your facility team didn't go down into the ravine," she said, "and I did not cooperate with their assessment." Something moved across his face. Not admiration, she did not think he was capable of that in this moment, but something like it, the involuntary acknowledgement of a fact that had defeated his planning. "You followed us," he said, 40 miles in those conditions, with," he looked at her wrist, at the splint. "You followed a convoy through the Cascades for 4 days with a broken wrist." "Fractured," she said, "not a complete break. I've been told that's not as reassuring a distinction as it sounds." He actually laughed, a short, involuntary sound that died immediately. "You have nothing," he said. "You have no weapon, no radio, no unit. You're one person. You can't stop me from boarding that aircraft and completing this flight." "The fuel flow control is in position 2, she said. "You'll get about 400 feet of altitude before the irregularity becomes unmanageable. 400 feet over these mountains in this wind is not a survivable scenario. I've done the math." He stared at her. I can fix it, he said. You can, she agreed. It'll take you about 6 minutes with the right tools. I'll wait. I'll shoot you. Then you'll have to fix it yourself. And you don't know which lever I moved. The pistol was still raised. She watched his eyes move between her and the service panel and back to her, running the calculation, weighing the variables. This was the moment. She could feel it the way she felt turbulence before the instruments registered it, the specific atmospheric pressure of a situation at its pivot point. The soldiers are already out of the facility, she said. Your guards are chasing a conveyor activation in the western section. Your buyer's window closes in 22 minutes. And I have a satellite transmitter in my vest pocket that has been recording this conversation since you opened the cockpit door. The silence between them had physical weight. Rhodes lowered the pistol 3 inches. Not all the way, 3 inches. What do you want? He said. I want you to say it again, she said. What you said in the radio room, out loud, into this transmitter. I want you to say who gave the order for the attack on the helicopter and why. You heard that. I recorded it, but I want it again, clearly, without the conduit housing between your mouth and the receiver. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was tight. She could see the calculations moving behind his eyes, the remaining escape options, the legal exposure, the specific mathematics of a man who had spent years treating other people's lives as variables in his personal profit equation, and was now discovering that one of those variables had survived and was standing in front of him with 4 days of mountain wilderness on her face and absolutely no interest in his excuses. You're going to turn me in regardless, he said. Yes. Then why would I confess? Because the recording I already have is enough to end your freedom. A second recording with your full cooperation might, and I am not promising this, I am telling you it is a possibility, might influence how the rest of your life goes. Courts pay attention to the difference between a man who fought the evidence and a man who understood what he did and said so. He looked at the pistol in his hand. Then he looked at her. You could have been a lawyer, he said. I could have been a lot of things, she said. I chose to fly, and you chose to blow up the aircraft I was flying in. So here we are. He was quiet for 10 seconds, she counted. Then he said, I authorized the attack on the helicopter. I planned the operation from the beginning. The abduction was staged. I used Holloway's platoon as cover for my own extraction. The technology in this case does not belong to me. I was selling it to Silas Voss for delivery to a foreign buyer. The soldiers were not supposed to survive. None of them. He said it in the flat, careful voice of a man giving a deposition, and she let the transmitter record every syllable. When he finished, he looked at her with an expression record every syllable. When he finished, he looked at her with an expression she could not entirely categorize. It was somewhere between relief and exhaustion and the hollow recognition of someone who has finally reached the end of a road they chose badly. It started small, he said. It always starts small, one piece of information. One route, one... I don't want your explanation, she said. I want your weapon. He looked at the pistol, then he turned it handle first and held it out to her. She took it with her right hand and kept it pointed in his general direction and said, Step away from the aircraft. He stepped away from the aircraft. And that was when Silas Voss came through the maintenance corridor door with 4 armed men behind him. Voss was not what she had expected. She had constructed a mental image over 4 days of tracking something operatic, something that matched the scale of what he had arranged. The reality was a man of about 60 in a dark jacket with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who had not needed to use physical force personally in a very long time, because he had always had people to do it for him. He was not dramatic. He was precise. And that was in its own way more frightening than drama. He assessed the situation in the time it took him to cross from the corridor door to the edge of the landing pad. He saw Rhodes standing away from the helicopter. He saw Brooke with the pistol. He saw the aluminum case on the seat inside the cockpit. He said nothing to Rhodes. He looked at Brooke. Chief Warrant Officer Sullivan, he said, you're more persistent than advertised. I've been hearing that a lot this week, she said. You have a pistol with approximately 15 rounds in a body that, based on visual assessment, has sustained significant trauma over the past several days. He stopped walking. His 4 men spread to flanking positions around her. I have considerably more assets available. You have considerably more assets currently chasing a conveyor system in your western section, she said. One of his men spoke into a radio. She heard the response, confused, overlapping voices, a report of no breach. At the east exit, questions about the origin of the conveyor activation. Voss listened to the radio exchange without changing his expression. Clever, he said. You're also a few minutes from being surrounded by the remainder of my personnel who will return from the western section shortly. So I would like to propose a practical arrangement. I'm listening, she said. She was not listening in the sense of considering his offer. She was listening in the sense of buying time because 20 seconds earlier, she had heard from the eastern edge of the facility the specific sounds of 6 soldiers moving through a corridor. Holloway had not left. She had told him to go through the south corridor. She had told him the east tunnel was the decoy. He had heard her. He had moved his team. And then because Grant Holloway was Grant Holloway and she had known him for 4 years and should have accounted for this, he had come back. Voss was saying something about the transmitter, about the recording, about the practical reality of evidence that disappeared versus evidence that was preserved. She tracked the words with the part of her brain that handled words while the rest of her was counting the sounds from the eastern corridor, calibrating the position of Holloway's team, calculating the angle. I want the transmitter, Voss said. I want it intact and I want it now. And in exchange, I will allow you and the remaining soldiers to leave this facility. You have my word. She looked at him. Your word, she said, my word. The word of the man who paid a federal engineer to blow up a helicopter with 8 people inside. He did not flinch. Business decisions and personal assurances are different categories. Not to me, she said. And then Holloway came through the corridor door. He came in fast with Webb on his right and Bennett on his left and the 3 soldiers behind them, and they were carrying weapons they should not have had. And then she understood because Holloway had not left through the south corridor immediately. He had taken his team back through the processing tunnel, first the section where Voss's guards had stashed the confiscated weapons before moving to the detention room, the section that had been emptied of personnel when she activated the conveyor, and Holloway had simply picked up what belonged to him. Voss's 4 men raised their weapons. Holloway's team raised theirs. The landing pad went very still. Mr. Voss, Holloway said. He was breathing hard from the run, but his voice was completely steady. Put your weapons on the ground. Voss looked at the 6 soldiers. He looked at the 4 men beside him. He did the arithmetic with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this kind of arithmetic many times. You're outgunned, one of Voss's men said. We've been outgunned since Tuesday, Webb said. We're still here. Voss raised one hand. His men looked at him. He lowered the hand slowly, palm down. The weapons came down. Brooke exhaled. She had not realized she was holding her breath. She noted this fact with the distant, slightly amused awareness of someone whose body was operating several systems simultaneously and had simply not allocated resources to breathing for the last 30 seconds. Holloway crossed to her. He looked at her face, at the pistol in her hand, at the satellite transmitter visible in her vest pocket. Then he looked at Rhodes, who was standing alone by the edge of the landing pad, with the expression of a man who had already begun the long internal process of understanding exactly how wrong every decision he had ever made had been. Is that him? Holloway said. That's him, she said. Holloway looked at Rhodes for a moment. Just looked. The kind of look that did not require words and did not benefit from them. Then he turned back to Brooke. You got a confession. 2 of them, she said. One with ambient noise from a utility conduit and one standing in front of the helicopter he was trying to escape in. Holloway made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of someone processing something too large for a single emotional response. And Voss, his voice is on the second recording as well, offering to trade the transmitter for our freedom, which is its own kind of admission. Holloway nodded slowly. 4 days, he said. It was not a question. It was a number he was placing somewhere inside himself, finding a space for it, giving it the weight it deserved. Approximately, she said. Bennett stepped forward. He was looking at her with an expression that was trying to be professional and not quite succeeding. You were in the crawl space, he said, above the detention room. You heard us talking. I heard enough, she said. He pressed his lips together, nodded once. The medical tape, he said. I kept it. I know, I saw you. He reached into his jacket pocket and she thought he was going to take it out, but he did not. He just pressed his hand flat against the pocket, against the shape of the small strip of tape inside and left it there. You came back, he said. You left me a trail. she said. That was all either of them needed to say about that. Voss was watching the exchange with the careful attention of a man cataloging information he might be able to use. She noticed this and looked at him directly. Don't, she said. He looked away. Webb had zip-tied Voss's men using materials from the aircraft's emergency kit. He was now looking at Rhodes with the particular expression of a 12-year veteran who had eaten cold rations for 4 days in a detention cell because of this man's decisions, and who was exercising, at considerable personal cost, the kind of restraint that separated professional soldiers from the alternative. You want me to secure him? Webb asked Brooke. She looked at Rhodes. Are you going to cause problems? Rhodes shook his head. He was looking at the ground. He had been looking at the ground since Holloway arrived. Secure him anyway, she said. While Webb handled that, Holloway came to stand beside her, shoulder to shoulder, facing the eastern ridge, where the first thin light of the approaching dawn was beginning to differentiate sky from mountain. The transmission you sent from the ranger tower, he said quietly. I don't know if it reached anyone. It reached someone, he said, because I have been thinking about the alternative since you showed up in that detention room, and the alternative is that we fight our way out against whatever reinforcements are still in this facility, and I ran the numbers on that while we were moving through the processing tunnel, and the numbers are not good. The numbers are not good, she agreed. So the transmission reached someone. She looked at him. That's not how probability works, Grant. I know how probability works. I'm choosing not to use it right now. He glanced at her. You of all people should understand that. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, if it reached someone, they'll need a flight path through the western approach. The eastern ridge generates turbulence at low altitude in this wind pattern. The safest insertion point is the clearing approximately 2 kilometers north of the perimeter. Holloway looked at her with an expression that was equal parts fondness and exasperation. You cannot help yourself, he said. I'm a pilot. I think about approach vectors. Even now, especially now, he smiled. It was a small, tired, genuine smile, the kind that only appears at the end of something very long and very difficult, when the body finally allows the face to do something other than manage threat. And then from somewhere beyond the eastern ridge, beyond the tree line, beyond the darkness that was slowly losing its argument with the approaching dawn, they heard it. A sound that Brooke Sullivan knew better than she knew almost anything else in the world. Rotors. Not one set, multiple, coming fast and low from the west, which was wrong for the eastern approach, but correct for the western, correct for the clearing 2 kilometers north, correct for exactly the insertion pattern she would have filed if she had been planning the rescue. Holloway straightened. Tell me that's ours, Webb said from behind them. Brooke listened to the rotor cadence, listened to the frequency, the spacing, the specific mechanical signature of the aircraft type. She felt something move through her that was larger than relief and quieter than joy. Something she did not have a word for because there was no single word for the particular experience of having been right about something that your life depended on. Blackhawks, she said, 2 of them. Military approach formation. She paused. Those are ours. Holloway put his hand on her shoulder for exactly 1 second. She pressed the transmit button on the maintenance radio. Inbound flight, this is Chief Warrant Officer Sullivan. I have 6 personnel plus 2 prisoners at the landing pad. Recommend approach from the northwest clear of the ridge turbulence. I will mark position. Over. Static, then a voice she did not recognize. Chief Warrant Officer Sullivan, we copy. Are you injured? She looked at her wrist, at her shoulder, thought about the ribs, thought about 4 days of mathematics she had done with her body that her body had not fully agreed to. Functional, she said. Holloway made a sound beside her. Define functional, the radio voice said. I'm standing and talking. That'll have to do for the next 10 minutes. Copy that. We have you on visual. Colonel Shaw sends her regards. Brooke paused. Shaw, Colonel Rebecca Shaw, who had been her instructor during survival training 7 years ago, who had recognized something in a broken transmission from a ranger tower at 0:30, because she had apparently recognized an emergency phrase that Brooke had used during a training exercise so long ago, she had nearly forgotten it herself. Shaw had convinced command to launch. Shaw had recognized a ghost voice in a broken signal and had refused to wait for certainty. Brooke pressed the transmit button. Tell Colonel Shaw, she stopped. Tried to find words large enough for what she needed to say. Could not. Tell her thank you. She says you're welcome, and she says she told command you were alive. She says no one believed her. Sounds about right, Brooke said. The helicopters came over the ridge in the growing light, and the facility's perimeter lights were still burning, and Voss's remaining personnel were emerging from the western section into a situation that had decisively changed while they were chasing a conveyor system, and Bennett was standing with his hand over the pocket that held a strip of medical tape, and Webb was saying something profane and grateful simultaneously. And Rhodes was sitting on the ground with his hands secured and his eyes closed, and Silas Voss was watching the helicopters with the expression of a man calculating how long the next phase of his life was going to be. Brooke guided the aircraft in. She used the maintenance radio and she talked the pilots through the western approach with the same calm precision she used in any cockpit, any weather, any situation. The voice that Danny Reyes had learned to read, that Holloway had learned to trust, that the young crew members in her training courses were going to hear for years after this. The first Black Hawk touched down 40 meters from the landing pad. Federal tactical teams came out of the second aircraft and moved through the perimeter with the organized efficiency of people who had been briefed on the layout and had someone on the ground to verify the information. Within 8 minutes, the facility was contained. Within 12, the access roads were secured. Within 15, the remaining mercenaries had made the same arithmetic decision that Voss's 4 men had made on the landing pad and had concluded that the calculation no longer favored resistance. Holloway got his soldiers moving toward the medevac aircraft. He pushed, cajoled, ordered, and in at least one case physically steered the men who needed to be steered, moving with the relentless forward momentum of a leader who understood that the mission was not over until every member of his team was off this mountain. He came back for Brooke last. She was still standing at the edge of the landing pad. She had not moved since she guided the aircraft in. She realized in a distant and slightly surprised way that she had not moved because her body had apparently decided now that the immediate requirements were satisfied to submit an itemized list of everything it had been doing for the past 96 hours and to request that she address it at her earliest possible convenience. The list was long. "Brooke," Holloway said, "I'm fine." "You are not fine. You are the opposite of fine. You are the most comprehensively not fine person I have seen in 20 years of service. I guided the aircraft in. You guided the aircraft in, and now the medics are going to have a turn." He stepped in front of her. "Give me the transmitter." She handed it to him. "The aluminum case is on the seat inside the helicopter. Rhodes's helicopter. Don't let anyone touch the locking mechanism. The evidence chain needs to be clean." "I'll tell them." The second recording is the better one. The first has conduit interference, but the authentication codes are audible if they clean up the background. "Brooke, the ventilation dampers in the utility junction are still adjusted. Someone needs to reset them before—" "Brooke." He put his hands on her shoulders gently, carefully aware of the injury, and looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention of someone who needed her to stop talking for 30 seconds. "I have the transmitter. I have the recordings, I have the case, and I have the prisoners, and I have all 5 of my soldiers. Everything you went and got, I have it. You can stop now." She looked at him. She felt the ribs acknowledge the permission. She felt the wrist re-register its condition with fresh emphasis. She felt 4 days of cold and rain and impossible mathematics settle into her body all at once, the way a debt comes due, not all at once during the crisis, but precisely at the moment the crisis ends. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay," he agreed. He put his arm around her shoulders on the side that wasn't injured, and they walked toward the helicopter together. Behind them in the growing dawn, the Black Hawks sat on the mountain with their rotors turning and their lights burning, and the facility that had been intended as a place of permanent endings was now instead a place where the evidence was being collected, the prisoners were being secured, and a group of soldiers who had not been supposed to survive the week were getting ready to go home. Brooke Sullivan did not look back. She had already seen everything that mattered. The medevac team that came off the first Black Hawk was led by a combat medic named Sergeant First Class Diane Okafor. And Diane Okafor had been doing this job for 14 years, which meant she had seen most things that could happen to a human body in the field, and had developed over those 14 years the particular professional composure of someone who did not allow what she was seeing to register on her face until she had finished doing what needed to be done. She looked at Brooke Sullivan for approximately 3 seconds. Then she looked at Holloway. "How long?" she said. 4 days, Holloway said. Okafor looked back at Brooke. Her professional composure held, but only just. "I need you to sit down," she said to Brooke. "I'd rather stand," Brooke said. "I understand that. Sit down anyway." Brooke sat down on the edge of the landing pad. The act of sitting, the permission of it, the simple physical relief of transferring weight from her legs to a surface hit her harder than she expected. She felt the world tilt slightly and then corrected itself the way a gyroscope finds its center, and she sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance and let Okafor do her job. The inventory took 6 minutes. Okafor worked quickly and spoke quietly, narrating findings into a small recorder attached to her vest. Fractured radius left wrist. 3 confirmed fractured ribs, possible 4th. Partial thickness burns along the left shoulder and upper back dressed with field materials that Okafor examined with the expression of someone who was both impressed and disturbed simultaneously. Laceration right shoulder approximately 4 inches closed, but not sutured, showing early signs of infection. Concussion assessed at moderate severity based on response to light and the quality of Brooke's answers to the standard questions. "Follow my finger," Okafor said. Brooke followed the finger. "What day is it?" "Friday or Saturday. I lost track of Friday." "What's the last thing you ate?" Brooke thought about this. "Half a compression ration bar." "Yesterday morning." "Or the morning before?" The days started to merge around day 3. Okafor made a sound that was not quite a word. She reached into her kit and produced a glucose packet and held it out. "Drink this," she said. Brooke drank it. It tasted like the best thing she had ever consumed, which told her more about her current state than any of Okafor's questions had. "You need surgery on that wrist," Okafor said. "The ribs we can manage conservatively, but I want imaging on them. The burns need proper dressing before infection sets in. The concussion needs monitoring, which means I do not want you losing consciousness without someone beside you." "I won't lose consciousness," Brooke said. "You've been running on adrenaline for 96 hours. When that clears, your body is going to present you with a bill. I need you to understand that." "I understand that." Okafor held her gaze for a moment. She had the eyes of someone who was accustomed to patients who believed they were more functional than they were, and she was evaluating whether Brooke fell into that category. "You're more self-aware than most," she said finally. It sounded like a grudging compliment. "I've been doing my own triage for 4 days," Brooke said. "I had time to learn my own injuries." "I noticed your field dressings," Okafor said. "The wrist splint is actually very good." "Thank you. You had one functional hand." "I had one functional hand and an aluminum channel from a helicopter fuselage and approximately 40 minutes on the second night. I made it work." Okafor shook her head slowly. Not in disbelief, but in the specific way of someone who was revising a number upward. Then she turned to her kit and began proper dressings, and Brooke sat still and let her and watched the activity around the facility with the steady attention of someone who could not fully turn off the part of her brain that was still tracking the situation. The federal tactical teams were thorough. She watched them move through the perimeter, and she watched the prisoner transfers, and she watched Holloway speaking to the senior federal agent, a woman in a dark jacket who had arrived in the second wave, and was conducting the conversation with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been briefed in transit and was already 3 steps into the investigation. She watched the aluminum case being logged and transferred under armed escort. She watched 2 agents enter the facility with evidence collection equipment. She watched Voss being walked to a transport vehicle with his hands secured and his face arranged in the careful neutrality of a man who had decided his next words would be chosen by a very expensive lawyer. She watched Rhodes. Rhodes was seated on the ground near the perimeter fence with 2 agents beside him. He was not restrained beyond standard cuffs. He was not being physically mistreated. He was simply sitting and looking at nothing in particular and occasionally answering questions from a 3rd agent who crouched beside him with a notepad. He looked from this distance like an ordinary person, like someone you might sit beside on a flight without ever imagining what he was capable of. That was the thing about betrayal that nobody prepared you for. It did not announce itself with a particular face. Holloway came back from his conversation with the federal agent and crouched beside Brooke, eye level, the way he did when he wanted to talk without making her tilt her head. "The transmission reached Shaw at 0147, he said. "She spent 40 minutes convincing command it was real. She told them she recognized a phrase you used during a survival training exercise, something about testing impossible odds. Brooke processed this. I used that phrase in a training debrief 7 years ago. She remembered it. She remembered it. And she went to the deputy commanding general, directly bypassed the normal confirmation process, and argued that waiting for verification meant waiting too long. He paused. Command was not enthusiastic. She was persuasive. Shaw has always been persuasive. She apparently told the general that if he was wrong, the worst outcome was an unauthorized rescue mission that found nothing. And if she was wrong, the worst outcome was that we were all dead before anyone checked. He looked at her steadily. She also told him that Brooke Sullivan had never transmitted a distress call that turned out to be nothing. That if you sent a message, there was a reason. Brooke was quiet for a moment. She bet her career on the signal from a broken transmitter, she said. She bet her career on you, Holloway said. Okafor pressed a new dressing against Brooke's shoulder, and Brooke absorbed the pain of it without sound and kept her eyes on the middle distance. The soldiers, she said. All 5. What's the status? Webb has a fractured collarbone. He's been walking on for 4 days without telling anyone, which I found out when Okafor's team examined him, and he nearly passed out. Henderson has soft tissue damage in both knees from the initial ambush. Garza has a concussion that he also did not mention. Bennett is Holloway paused. Bennett is the youngest and somehow the least injured, which I'm choosing to interpret as the universe making a proportional decision. And you? He looked at her with the expression of someone who had been hoping that question would not come up. Grant, 2 ribs, nothing dramatic. You have 2 fractured ribs, and you've been moving my team and leaving trail markers and doing what needed to be done, yes. We can discuss the irony of that given your current situation at a later date. She would have laughed if her own ribs had allowed it. What happens now, she said, to the investigation? Holloway settled his weight back on his heels. The senior agent, her name is Chen. She's FBI, told me that the satellite transmitter and the recordings are sufficient to open a federal case immediately. The authentication codes Rhodes transmitted to the buyer are apparently connected to a broader intelligence breach that the agency has been tracking for 18 months. Rhodes is not the only person in this network. He is, according to Chen, a significant node, but not the only one. Brooke absorbed this. He said it started small, 1 piece of information. They always say that. He was selling classified routes, identities, operational schedules. She thought about all the operations those disclosures could have touched. All the people who had moved through those routes without knowing the information had been compromised. How long? Chen thinks at least 6 years, possibly longer. Holloway's voice was even, but his jaw was tight. The helicopter attack was not his first operation. It was simply the first time he intended to eliminate an entire American unit. 6 years. The number sat between them with the particular heaviness of things that cannot be undone. 6 years of information sold. 6 years of operations conducted against a background of compromised intelligence. 6 years of men and women moving through the field without knowing that someone with a federal clearance had already handed their routes to the highest bidder. The people who trusted his clearance over my field observations, Brooke said quietly. Holloway looked at her. Chen is aware of that. It's in her preliminary notes. The fact that you flagged anomalies and were overruled is part of the operational record now. I'm not asking for vindication, Grant. I know you're not. I'm telling you anyway, because it matters. Because the next time a pilot on an extraction flight says something feels wrong, I want there to be a record that says what happens when that concern gets dismissed. He held her gaze. The failure was not intelligence. The failure was arrogance. Chen's words, not mine. Someone stopped listening to the person closest to the danger. Okafor finished the dressing on Brooke's shoulder and moved to the wrist, working carefully around the field splint. And Brooke watched Holloway's face as he said these things and thought about the weight of those words, not for herself, but for the next pilot, the next soldier, the next person who noticed something that the people above them decided not to hear. I want to check on my soldiers, she said. You are my soldiers, Holloway said. The statement landed without drama, the way true things often did. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them made anything more of it than what it was. Okafor, Holloway said. 2 more minutes, Okafor said without looking up. She wants to 2 more minutes, Lieutenant. Holloway closed his mouth. The 2 minutes passed. Okafor stood and repacked her kit with the efficiency of long practice. She looked at Brooke with the evaluating directness of someone writing a final assessment. I want you on the first transport out, she said. I want you horizontal within the hour. I want imaging on those ribs before any decisions are made about recovery timeline. Understood, Brooke said. I'm serious about the adrenaline crash. It will come. I know it will come. Okafor studied her for another moment. Then she said in a slightly different voice, quieter with the register of someone speaking outside their professional role for exactly one sentence. I don't know how you walked 40 miles on those ribs. Brooke thought about the answer to that. She thought about the cold water in the drainage passage, the Ranger Tower with its broken transmitter, the 11-minute patrol cycle and the 4-foot blind strip at the base of the camera. Bennett's medical tape, Holloway's compass, needle in the mud. I didn't do it alone, she said. She stood up from the edge of the landing pad. Okafor steadied her with one hand, not making a production of it, just present. Brooke found her footing and nodded. She walked to where Holloway's soldiers were being treated by the second medevac team, gathered near the first Blackhawk. She walked past Webb, who looked up from where he was sitting with his arm in a temporary sling, and said with complete sincerity, Ma'am, I want you to know that I did not believe you were dead. Not for 1 minute. Thank you, Webb. I told the others. I said Brooke Sullivan does not go down in a ravine. I said she would find a way. And did they believe you? He glanced at the others. Eventually. Henderson gave her a chin lift, the specific nonverbal acknowledgement of soldiers who have decided that words are insufficient and gestures will have to carry the weight. Garza stood up when she approached him and then sat back down immediately because his concussion apparently had opinions about standing, and she put her hand on his shoulder briefly and said nothing because nothing was what the moment called for. She stopped in front of Bennett. He was sitting on the ground with his back against the Blackhawk's fuselage. His hands were in his lap. He looked up when she stopped in front of him, and his expression was the particular combination of exhaustion and relief and complicated emotion that she recognized from the faces of people who had been through something that would take years to fully understand. How are you doing, Corporal? She said. Honestly? He thought about it. I'm not sure yet. I think I'll know better in about a week. That's the right answer. I kept thinking in there in the detention room. I kept thinking about what you said in the pre-mission briefing, about one more decision, about testing the odds before you accept them. I remember saying that. I thought about it every time it felt like the situation was finished. Every time it felt like there was no next move. He looked at his hands. It helped. She crouched in front of him at his level, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and she said, the trail you left me. That was Lieutenant Holloway, he said immediately. The lieutenant left the markers. You kept them. She held his gaze. In a detention room with no weapons and no communication and no way to know whether anyone was coming, you kept a strip of medical tape because you had decided to believe that someone might still be following. That is not a small thing, Noah. It was the first time she had used his given name. She saw him register it. His throat worked. I didn't want it to be for nothing, he said. The trail. Whatever Lieutenant Holloway left, I didn't want it to disappear into the mud. It didn't, she said. She stood back up. The adrenaline that Okafor had warned her about was beginning its slow withdrawal, and she could feel the edges of what was underneath the real weight of 4 days, the full accounting that her body had been deferring. She recognized the feeling, and she did not fight it. She had asked everything of herself that she could ask, and the asking was finished, and what came next was recovery. But not yet. Not quite yet. Holloway appeared beside her. He had been talking to Agent Chen again. She could tell by the slight tension in his face, the look of someone who has been receiving information that he is still processing. There's something you need to know, he said. Tell me. Danny Reyes. He watched her face when he said the name. Your co-pilot. He survived the jump. Both crew members who jumped made it out. Search teams found them on day 2, approximately 1.5 miles from the crash site. They were treated for injuries and transported to Madigan. She stood absolutely still. She had not let herself think about Danny. She had made a deliberate operational decision on day 1 not to occupy any mental space with questions she could not answer. And Danny Reyes had been the first thing she had placed in that closed room and locked away because she could not afford to grieve and move simultaneously. He's alive, she said. He's alive. He has a broken leg and some burns, and apparently he asked about you every time anyone came near his room. She turned away from Holloway for a moment, turned toward the eastern ridge where the dawn was fully committed. Now the sky moving through pale gray into the first suggestion of blue. She breathed carefully, attending to her ribs, and let the information settle into her. The way large things settle, slowly taking up the space they need, rearranging everything around them. Danny Reyes was alive. She had told him to hold on, and he had held on, and he was alive at Madigan Army Medical Center, asking about her. Okay, she said when she could say something without her voice doing something she did not intend. Okay, Holloway said quietly. She turned back. Agent Chen was crossing the landing pad toward them, moving with purpose. Chief Warrant Officer Sullivan, Chen said. She was about 45 with the direct efficiency of someone who did not waste words. I need approximately 10 minutes of your account before you're transported. I understand you're injured, so I'll be brief. You can have 20, Brooke said. Ask what you need. Chen opened her notepad. Starting from when you first noticed anomalies in Rhodes's behavior. Before the missile strike. Brooke took her through it. The clothes, the nav array, the absence of questions about colleagues, and the specific quality of his attention, not the attention of a terrified man looking for safety, but the attention of someone checking that a system was functioning correctly. She described the satellite transmitter, its location, the metadata she had read in the partial recovery screen. She described the message. She described what it told her about the timeline of the betrayal and the precision of the operations planning. Chen wrote without looking up. Occasionally, she asked a clarifying question. She was precise, and she did not editorialize, and she did not express surprise at anything Brooke told her, which was its own kind of professional respect. When Brooke finished, Chen closed the notepad. The planning detail you observed, she said, is consistent with what we've been developing on the broader network for 18 months. Rhodes is connected to at least 4 other active cases. The authentication codes on the transmitter have already been matched to 2 previous intelligence breaches that resulted in operational compromises. She paused. In one of those cases, a 2-person reconnaissance team was reported killed in action in a situation that, in light of this morning's evidence we are now reviewing. Brooke heard what Chen was not quite saying. Rhodes's information may have gotten people killed before, she said. That is what we are reviewing, Chen said carefully. The weight of that settled over the landing pad. Webb looked at the ground. Henderson closed his eyes briefly. Garza was very still. Then you need to move fast, Brooke said. On the network, the other nodes. We are moving, Chen said. She looked at Brooke with an expression that was not warm exactly, but was something adjacent to it, the recognition of one professional by another. You recovered evidence under conditions that most trained field operatives would not have survived. The recordings, the transmitter, the confession, the case we are building this morning would not exist without them. The platoon kept itself alive, Brooke said. I just followed their trail. Chin looked at Holloway, then back at Brooke. That is a generous reading of the situation. It's an accurate one, Brooke said. Chen accepted this with a slight nod and moved back across the landing pad toward the evidence processing area. Brooke watched her go and felt the adrenaline continue its withdrawal, steady and inevitable, like a tide going out. Okafor materialized at her elbow. Transport is ready, she said. I would like you on it now, please. 1 more minute. You've been saying 1 more minute for 20 minutes. Holloway looked at her. She has. Brooke turned to face the facility one last time. Not because she needed to see it, because she needed to close it, to look at the place where something terrible had been planned and executed and ultimately answered, and to put it behind her with the specific intentional finality that prevents a location from becoming a presence that follows you home. She looked at the fence and the perimeter and the low buildings with their lights still burning in the early morning and the activity of federal agents doing the careful documented work of justice. She looked at where Voss had been standing when his people put their weapons down. She looked at the service panel on the helicopter with its fuel flow control in position 2. She looked at the maintenance corridor door she had come through at 0331, running on the last of everything she had. She said goodbye to it without words. Then she turned toward the Black Hawk. Holloway walked beside her. He did not offer his arm. He knew her well enough not to offer his arm. But he was there, his shoulder approximately 6 inches from hers, close enough that she could have reached if she needed to reach, which she did not. She stopped at the aircraft door and looked at him. The flight insignia, she said. She had not thought about it until now. Her insignia, the wings she had worn since graduation. The specific hardware that identified her as a qualified Army aviator had been on her flight vest when the helicopter went down. Holloway reached into his jacket pocket. He held out her wings. She stared at them. Webb found them in the crash debris on the way out of the facility, he said. The main vest was destroyed, but the insignia came through. He carried them the whole way without telling anyone. She looked across at Webb, who was being loaded onto a stretcher 20 feet away and was very determinedly looking in the opposite direction, which confirmed everything. She took the wings from Holloway's hand, held them for a moment. The metal was cold. "You came back for all of us," Holloway said. She looked up at him, at the face she had known for 4 years, marked now by 4 days of captivity and cracked ribs, in the specific accumulated weight of leadership under impossible conditions. At the man who had kept his soldiers alive with barbecue restaurants in Tacoma and phone calls to estranged brothers and the stubborn, irrational insistence that a dead pilot might still be following. "No," she said, "we all came back for one another." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once the way men nod when something is true and complete and does not require any further building upon. She climbed into the Black Hawk. Okafor was immediately beside her, and the warmth of the aircraft's cabin hit her like something physical, and she felt the accumulated cold of 4 days begin very slowly, cautiously, as if it were not certain it was safe to leave to release its grip on her bones. She sat in the troop seat and held her wings in her right hand and listened to the rotors accelerate and felt the aircraft lift. She looked out the window as the Black Hawk climbed away from Black Ridge Mine. The facility shrank below her, organized and small from altitude, the way all of it would eventually become organized and small in memory, not less real, not less significant, but proportional, placed correctly in relation to everything around it. The Cascade spread in every direction, dark and enormous and indifferent to everything that had happened in their valleys this week. She looked at the ridgeline to the east where the dawn was completing its work on the sky and thought about a river gorge and a broken fuselage and a woman who had opened her eyes in cold water and made a decision. The helicopter banked west toward Madigan. She let herself lean back against the seat. Okafor put a blanket around her shoulders without being asked, and Brooke closed her fingers around her wings, and somewhere in the forward section of the aircraft she could hear Holloway's voice low and steady, making sure every member of his team was accounted for one more time, because that was what he did and would keep doing until the last of them was through the hospital door and the debt of care was properly and completely settled. She closed her eyes. Not in defeat, not in the warmth that hypothermia offers, in the particular earned exhaustion of someone who has finished something that needed finishing and done it in a way she could live with and is now finally on the other side of it. The Black Hawk carried them west through the morning sky, all of them going home. She woke up in a hospital bed at Madigan Army Medical Center, and the first thing she noticed was that someone had placed her flight wings on the bedside table where she could see them without turning her head. The second thing she noticed was Danny Reyes sitting in a wheelchair beside the bed with his left leg in a cast and an expression that was trying very hard to be professional and not succeeding at all. "You were supposed to wait," he said. His voice broke on the last word. He did not look away. Brooke looked at him for a long moment, at the burns on his forearms, healing now but still visible, at the cast, at the face she had last seen in the moment before the second explosion when she had been shouting at him to hold on, and the aircraft was coming apart around them. "How long?" she said. Her voice was rough from sleep and the particular dryness of hospital air. 3 days, he said. "You've been out 3 days. They kept you sedated for the first 2. Something about your body needing to stop running long enough for surgery to work." She processed this. Surgery on the wrist. She remembered being told of that before the transport. She looked at her left arm, which was now properly casted from palm to mid-forearm, clean and white against the hospital blanket. "The ribs," she said. 4 of them. Not 3 like you thought. 4. I said possibly 4. You told Okafor 3. I said at least 3. That includes 4. Danny looked at her with the expression of a man who was extremely relieved and extremely tired and was choosing to express both of those things through minor disagreement, because the alternative was something he was not ready to do in a hospital room. "You scared us," he said. "You scared all of us." "I know. Command listed you KIA. I know that too. I told them they were wrong," he said. "I told them from the moment they said it. I was still in the field when they made the call, and I told the search team, I said, look at the ravine, look at the river. She would have gone into the water to slow the descent. She would have used the fuselage as cover. He stopped, collected himself. They told me I was in shock and that my assessment was not reliable. You were in shock, she said gently. I was right, he said. You were both. He looked at his hands for a moment, then he looked up. When Shaw launched the rescue and they said Sullivan was alive and in the facility, I was in my room here and I heard it over the war radio and he shook his head. The professional composure gave up entirely. I've been sitting in this wheelchair for 3 days, waiting for you to wake up so I could tell you that I knew. I knew you weren't gone. Brooke reached across with her right hand and put it on his arm, briefly on a section of skin between the burns. She did not say anything. There were things between people who had been through what they had been through that words only diminished. After a moment he straightened, found his professional bearing again, and pulled it around himself like a coat. Holloway was here yesterday, he said. Was he? He stood in the doorway for about 5 minutes. Wouldn't come in because Okafor told him you needed to rest, and apparently he takes Okafor very seriously. He just stood there and then he left. Sounds like him. Bennett came with him, the young one. I know which one Bennett is. He left something on the table, next to your wings. She turned her head. On the other side of the wings, she had not noticed it because she had been looking at Danny, a small strip of medical tape folded once placed flat on the surface with the particular deliberateness of something that had been carried a long distance and set down with care. She looked at it for a long time. He left the trail marker, she said quietly. That's what Holloway said it was. I didn't know what it meant until he explained. She reached over and picked it up with her right hand. It was worn at the edges from 4 days in a jacket pocket, the adhesive long gone, just the fabric of the tape itself pale and creased. She held it in her palm, a strip of medical tape, the smallest possible evidence that someone had refused to give up. She closed her fingers around it. The weeks that followed were not cinematic. Recovery was not cinematic. It was physical therapy sessions where the wrist did not cooperate, and the therapist was patient in the specific, relentless way of someone who was going to win this argument, regardless of how long it took. It was ribs that complicated breathing during exertion and required her to relearn the relationship between effort and air, to negotiate each workout with her own body like a terms of service agreement where she was not entirely in control of the terms. It was nights that were sometimes harder than the days, not because of pain, though there was pain, but because the mountains came back in the dark in ways they did not during daylight. And there were moments at 3 a.m. when she was lying in a bed at Madigan and her mind was in a ravine with cold water and no radio, and she had to do the work, deliberately and systematically, of bringing herself back. She talked to the post's behavioral health officer 3 times a week. She did not announce this. She did not make it a statement. She went and she sat in the office and she talked because she had survived 4 days in the wilderness on the principle that the only way through a problem was to do the next available thing, and this was the next available thing. The investigation moved the way. Federal investigations move relentlessly, methodically, with the accumulated weight of 2 recording devices. 1 satellite transmitter, 1 aluminum case of stolen technology, and the voices of 2 men who had said incriminating things out loud at 03:30 in the morning on a private landing pad in the Cascade Mountains. 3 weeks after Operation Iron Lantern, she received a call from Agent Chen. Rhodes has entered a cooperation agreement, Chen said. How cooperative, Brooke said. Cooperative enough that we've identified 6 additional nodes in the network. 2 of them were still active. A pause. The 2 reconnaissance personnel I mentioned, the ones listed as killed in action 18 months ago, we're reopening both cases. Brooke sat with that for a moment. Did they survive? 1 did, Chen said. We found him 2 weeks ago. He's been living off-grid in Oregon for 14 months. He thought his own government had burned him. Brooke closed her eyes. And the other? The other did not survive, Chen said quietly. But his family is going to know what actually happened. That matters. Yes, Brooke said. It does. Voss faced federal charges on 11 separate counts. His legal team was expensive and thorough and ultimately unsuccessful because the satellite transmitter's authentication data connected to a chain of financial transactions that no legal team, however expensive, could explain away. He received 43 years. He would not see the outside of a federal facility under any actuarial projection that applied to a 60-year-old man. Rhodes received less. The cooperation agreement reduced his exposure. 22 years with the possibility of reduction contingent on the completeness of his testimony. Brooke read the sentencing report in her hospital room on a Tuesday afternoon and sat with her feelings about that number for a while. 22 years was not the same as the lives he had traded for money. It was not a balanced equation. But it was what the system produced when it worked correctly, and it was accompanied by a permanent revocation of security clearance, forfeiture of federal pension, and a public record that would follow his name for the rest of his life. It was not justice in the complete sense. It was the available version. She was cleared for limited duty at 8 weeks. She returned to Fort Lewis on a Tuesday morning in early December, driving herself because she could drive and because she wanted to, and she walked through the gates with a slight limp that the doctors told her would likely be permanent and that she had already decided she did not intend to apologize for. The formal investigation report had been released 2 weeks earlier. It cleared Holloway's platoon of any responsibility for the operational failure. It documented in specific and institutional language the fact that field warnings from aviation personnel had been dismissed because they conflicted with intelligence assessments and that this dismissal had contributed directly to the ambush. It recommended changes to extraction protocol, to the integration of aviation personnel in mission planning, and to the weighting given to on-site field observations when they contradicted pre-mission intelligence. It did not name the officers who had dismissed her concerns. That was a separate process ongoing. But it used her name, and it used the word overruled, and it said clearly that the next mission needed to listen to the person closest to the danger. That was what she had asked for, not recognition, just the institutional record that made the next correction more likely. Holloway met her in the parking lot. I was not supposed to meet her in the parking lot. She had told him specifically that she did not need an escort and that she was capable of walking to the building herself. Thank you. And he was there anyway, leaning against his vehicle with his arms crossed, in the particular expression of someone who had heard her instructions and made a separate decision. Granted, she said. Brooke, he said, I said I didn't need. I'm not here because you need me. I'm here because I wanted to be here. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her, the limp, the cast, the 8 weeks of recovery on her face and in her posture, and something else that was harder to name, the specific quality of a person who has been through something that changed the shape of them. Not visibly, not dramatically, but permanently. The ceremony is next week, he said. You know that. I know. Are you ready for it? She thought about the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how to answer questions. I'm ready to receive the award, she said. I'm not ready to be made into something I'm not. What does that mean? It means I've seen the preliminary remarks. Someone used the phrase superhuman endurance. Someone else used the phrase single-handedly. I need those things changed before I stand in front of anyone. Holloway looked at her. You did endure an extraordinary human endurance, she said. It was human, all of it. I was cold and I was scared and I almost stopped twice. And the only reason I didn't stop was because you left me a trail and Bennett kept a strip of tape and Shaw bet her career on a broken signal. If any one of those things had been different, we are having a very different conversation right now. She held his gaze. I will stand up and receive that award, but I will not accept credit that belongs to all of us. He was quiet for a moment. I'll talk to the ceremony coordinator, he said. Thank you. He pushed off from the vehicle and they walked toward the building together, and he matched her pace without drawing attention to the fact that he was matching her pace, which she noted and did not comment on. The ceremony was held on a Thursday morning in the second week of December. The room was full officers, soldiers, family members, a representative from the Secretary of the Army's office, Agent Chen in the third row with a notepad she was not using. Brooke stood at the front of the room in her dress uniform, her left arm in a lightweight, removable cast that she had been told she could leave at home for the occasion, and had chosen to wear it because she was not interested in presenting a more recovered version of herself than the one that actually existed. The remarks had been changed. She had insisted, and Holloway had backed her, and the ceremony coordinator had reworked the language until it said what it should say, that Operation Iron Lantern had succeeded because of collective refusal, shared responsibility, and the decision made by multiple individuals under impossible conditions to keep working the problem. When it was her turn to speak, she looked at the room for a moment before she began. She looked at Danny Reyes, who had transferred his wheelchair to a seat in the front row, and was watching her with the expression of a man who was proud and trying to look neutral and failing completely. She looked at Holloway's platoon, all 5 of the surviving soldiers seated together, Webb with his arms still in a partial sling, Bennett in the second seat with his hands quiet in his lap. She looked at Colonel Shaw, who had come down from her current posting and was sitting in the back row with the specific composure of someone who did not require acknowledgement and was present because she wanted to be, not because she needed to be seen. I'm not going to stand here and tell you a story about one person defeating impossible odds, Brooks said, because that's not what happened. The room was very quiet. What happened is that a group of soldiers kept each other alive in a detention room by asking what they were going to do when they got home. What happened is that a lieutenant with 2 cracked ribs left trail markers for a person he had no way of knowing was still alive, because leaving something was better than leaving nothing. What happened is that a young corporal kept a strip of medical tape for 4 days because he had decided, in the absence of any evidence, to believe that someone was still following. She paused. What happened is that a colonel recognized a phrase in a broken transmission from a ranger tower in the middle of the night and convinced an entire command structure to launch a rescue mission on the basis of that recognition. She did not wait for certainty. She made a decision with incomplete information because waiting for certainty would have cost lives. She looked at Shaw directly. Shaw looked back at her with the steady attention of someone who was listening with full investment. Courage is not always a single moment, Brooke said. It is almost never a single moment. Courage is a corporal in deciding to believe. It is a lieutenant leaving a mark that might never be found. It is a colonel going to the deputy commanding general at 2 in the morning and saying, I know this signal is real because I know this woman, and she does not send distress calls without reason. She let that settle. Every one of those decisions had to happen for the outcome to be what it was. Remove any single one of them, and the story ends differently. She looked at the representative from the secretary's office. The operational review found that field warnings were dismissed because they conflicted with pre-existing intelligence assessments. I want to say clearly for the record, and for anyone in this room who will be making those decisions in the future, the person closest to the danger sees things that intelligence reports cannot capture. That person's observations are not an inconvenience to be managed. They are data. They are often the most accurate data available. She kept her voice even. She was not angry. Anger had passed somewhere in the Cascades, somewhere between the river and the ranger tower, burned off by necessity. What remained was clarity. The cost of dismissing that data was borne by 8 soldiers and a helicopter crew. The next time someone is tempted to trust a clearance over a field observation, I would ask them to remember that. The room was still. Then Holloway started clapping. He started it alone, and Webb joined immediately, and then the rest of the platoon, and then the room, and it was not the polite applause of ceremony, but something rougher and more genuine. The sound of people who understood what she had said and were marking it. She stood at the front of the room and accepted it without moving, without performing, with the simple stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago that the only worthwhile response to recognition was to make sure it pointed in the right direction. Afterward, in the hallway outside the ceremony room, Bennett found her. I was wearing his dress uniform, and he looked older than he had in the detention room at Black Ridge Mine, which was not a function of time. 8 weeks was not enough time to age a person, but a function of what he was carrying, the specific weight that settles into the face of someone who has been through something and is in the ongoing process of integrating it. Ma'am, he said. Bennett. He reached into his jacket pocket. She knew what he was reaching for before his hand came out. I want you to have this, he said. He held out the strip of medical tape folded as it had been on her bedside table, worn at the edges, creased from weeks in his pocket. She looked at it. You've been carrying it since the mountain, she said. Yes. You should keep it. I want you to have it, he said again. His voice was steady, but his hand was not entirely steady. You followed it 40 miles with... He stopped, started again. You followed a strip of tape and a compass needle and a boot mark in the mud because the lieutenant left them and because you refused to stop. I want you to have it Because it means something different now than it meant when I picked it up. When I picked it up, it was something I was holding on to because I didn't want to give up. Now he looked for the word. Now it's proof that it works, that it was worth holding. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took it from his hand. She held it between her fingers and thought about the branch where Holloway had tied it in the rain and the dark for no one in particular. She thought about finding it and recognizing it and what it had done for her in that moment. Not solved anything, not changed any of the material facts of her situation, but reminded her that the trail existed because someone had believed she might still be on it. "I'll frame it," she said. He blinked. "Really? Holloway offered me a medal at the ceremony. I told him I'd rather have something that meant something." She looked at the tape. "This means something." He pressed his lips together and nodded, and the expression on his face was not something she was going to describe to anyone because it belonged to him and to the room and to the 8 weeks of distance between the mountain and this hallway. Months later, the Army implemented 3 formal changes to extraction protocol. Aviation personnel were included in mission planning from the initial briefing stage. Field observations from on-site personnel required documented consideration before they could be superseded by intelligence assessments. And extraction routes required independent verification separate from the intelligence source that generated them. The changes were not named after anyone. Institutional change rarely was. But everyone in the relevant departments knew where they had come from, and the paperwork that documented the recommendation cited Operation Iron Lantern and the specific failure mode that had allowed a mission to proceed on the basis of compromised intelligence and dismissed field warnings. Brooke helped design the new survival and recovery training program that Fort Lewis implemented the following spring. She wrote the curriculum with Holloway and an Army psychologist named Dr. Marcus Webb. No relation to Sergeant Webb, a fact that had briefly caused considerable confusion during the initial planning meetings. And the program was built around a single central principle. Survival under pressure is almost never a solo achievement. It is a network of decisions made by multiple people, some of whom will never know the effect their choice had on someone else. The program's first cohort completed training in June. 24 soldiers, pilots, and support personnel running through scenarios in the Cascades under conditions that were deliberately difficult and deliberately collaborative. No scenario solvable by one person alone. Every exercise requiring communication trust and the willingness to leave markers for someone who might not be following. Holloway visited on the final day with his platoon's 5 surviving members. They sat in the back of the briefing room and watched the cohort debrief, and afterward they answered questions with the particular directness of people who had been through the real version of what the training simulated. Bennett spoke for 20 minutes about the detention room, about what it had felt like to be in a situation with no apparent resolution, and what he had done with that feeling and why. He was 23 years old, and he spoke with the clarity of someone who had learned something important about themselves under conditions that did not leave room for pretending. When he finished one of the training cohort, a young pilot, female, maybe 25, raised her hand. "How do you keep going?" she said. "When you genuinely don't know if anyone is coming, when you have no evidence. How do you keep—" She paused, looking for the right word. "Believing," Bennett said. "Yes." He thought about it for a moment. The real kind of thinking, not the perform kind. "You decide," he said. "It's a decision. You look at the situation and you acknowledge that you don't know. And then you make a choice about what you're going to do with not knowing. You can use it to stop, or you can use it to keep going, because if there's any chance someone is coming, the worst thing you can do is make yourself harder to find." He paused. "Someone taught me that, not in a classroom. In a ravine in the middle of the night, when she decided that 4 days of impossible odds was not sufficient reason to stop working the problem." The young pilot nodded slowly. Brooke was standing at the back of the room. She had come in quietly after the debrief began, and she had listened to the whole thing from the back row, still slightly favoring her left side, the limp that the doctors had said was permanent and that she had stopped noticing sometime in March. She did not speak during the session. On the way out, the young pilot stopped beside her. "Are you her?" she said. "The pilot from Iron Lantern." Brooke looked at her for a moment, at the face of someone at the beginning of a career, nervous and eager, and trying to project more confidence than the nervousness allowed. "I'm the pilot whose team refused to leave anyone behind," she said. The young woman nodded. It was the answer she needed, even if she had not known it was the answer she needed. Brooke walked out into the June morning, into the training ground where the new cohort was preparing for their final exercise, and she stood for a moment with her face toward the light and her hand in her jacket pocket, where she kept, because she did keep it in her pocket, not in a frame, a strip of worn medical tape folded once creased from months of carrying. She was not invincible. She was not a legend. She was a pilot with a permanent limp and 4 healed ribs and a wrist that ached in cold weather, and a set of wings she had worn since graduation that had survived a helicopter crash because a sergeant with a fractured collarbone had picked them up from the mud and carried them 40 miles without telling anyone. She was the person who had refused to stop in a river gorge in the Cascades when stopping would have been entirely reasonable. She was the person who had followed a strip of tape and a compass needle and a boot mark through 40 miles of mountains because the people she served had not given up on her, and she was not capable of giving less in return. That was what loyalty looked like, not obedience, not the willingness to sacrifice yourself for an institution. The willingness to keep moving, to keep working, to keep leaving markers in the dark for the people who might still be following. The willingness to bet your career on a broken signal because you knew the person on the other end and she had never sent a distress call without reason. The willingness when everything said stop to choose one more decision. One more thing to try before you give up. One more mile.